Welcome. So, we're going to be talking about some different artistic representations of Job. I'm Jenny, and I'm going to be talking about I Am Legend, the 2007 film. So, there is also a book that it's based off of. I'm going to be talking about the film in this because it's very different. So, one of the main points is suffering. And obviously, Job goes through a lot of suffering, and so does Dr. Robert Neville in this. And a like post-apocalyptic world that he's living in. He's trying to find a cure for like this vampire disease. And so really some of these themes are how to live in this kind of world. And so both Job and Neville talk about like whether we turn towards or away from God. And there's a lot of pictures and symbolism with this, like these posters that say, God still loves us. And then the bottom one says, but do we still love God? And so you kind of get those representations and you see like his struggle of what to do with that. Also, there's this question of are you going to believe that like grace can triumph in the end? Um, and like he never gives up his hope for finding the cure. Um, and so you kind of see that through it. There's also this theme of lament. There's a lot of times where you will see both Neville and Job like crying, whether talking to like themselves or God or other people. There's a lot of really hard times. Um, and one specific thing that is unique to like Job is this lament that's complaint, where it's like, God, this is unacceptable. This is not how things should be running right now. And it's kind of this accountability almost for God to say this is not okay, um, which is very interesting. And you definitely see that a lot in the film as well, where Neville's like, God, you can't have an apocalypse here. If this is how you're going to do things, then I'm not going to have faith in you. Um, and so you see that, which is very interesting. You also have this like there's this no assurance that God is listening, and you see that throughout Job, where he's just going on like blind faith, just crying out to God. Um, and you see that a lot through the film, and you kind of see it in the lack of like is God even there anymore? Is he even listening? Um, so yeah, that's it with lament. And then the major theme is the sovereignty of God. Um, and you see this through the butterflies in the film. There are butterflies from the start through the back flashes of like before the apocalypse. And even in the very end scene when he's dying, you still see this butterfly. And that's kind of supposed to be representative of like God and beauty and grace. And that even in these like darkest times and even in like these monsters, there's still God present there. And that is something that is definitely prominent in the book of Job, with all of his suffering and the difficulties that he goes through. God is still there, and he's the one ruling, and he's the one who's in charge and sovereign, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense. So that's a little bit about Job and I Am Legend. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I related the story of Job with some of the events that happened in 2020. And there's a song called 2020 Waking Up is Hard to Do by The Wildlife. And they kind of just walk through these events in their form. And I just related a lot of the lines and stuff to Job. So this is a lot, but I'll just summarize it real quick. The first line that I notice is where he says, like, another day we see the sun, and these days I wish it wouldn't come. And there's like a lament in Job where he's talking about how he's very ungrateful for the fact that he's continuing to live, like, and he's longing for death, and it just never happens. And I saw like a very similar theme going on between those two things. And then the song says when it couldn't get much worse it does, and I think we all saw that through 2020, but I think Job especially saw that because he lost his house, his family, his servants, his livestock, and then eventually his friends and even his wife turned on him and were like, dude, just curse God, or like, this is your fault in some way. And then lastly, there's a line that says it's hard to trust what's up ahead, and then still waking up is hard to do, but it's easier because I have you. And I think like we see that theme throughout Job a lot where he doesn't know what's going on, he doesn't know what's coming, but because he still has his faith in God and he knows that God still loves him through all of this, even though he doesn't understand what's going on, he's able to like kind of persevere and remain faithful to him. And then these are just some things that I pointed out that we could learn by looking at the story of Job. And one author suggested that sometimes God allows pain and loss that have nothing to do with sin in our lives and are not meant to teach us anything. And I think that's really powerful because I think that when we are constantly looking for a reason why suffering happens, sometimes it leaves us kind of hopeless because we feel like if we can't find it, then it has to come back to us in some way. And then another author even said like that kind of mindset, thinking that like it has to have some kind of moral teaching or it has to be like a punishment for some sin, is really detrimental to people who are suffering because they're just saying like, well, you just have to accept God's injustice and not question him at all. And then the author from the first quote also said that throughout our suffering, God doesn't really require us to react in any specific way, but he does require us to hold on to our relationship with him and not give up on him just because we're going through suffering times. And then this was also just like a little bonus thing. I found out Bill Murray actually did like a dramatic rereading of Job during like the quarantine period. And so like obviously that's a very direct way that Job was related to the pandemic and to the year 2020 as a whole. But what I found really powerful was like one of the viewers sat down and was like, yes, I think about my own suffering through this, but also like it's made me rethink how I'm empathizing with other people who are suffering. And I think that's maybe something we can glean from the story of Job is not just like suffering in relation to God, but looking at how like his wife and friends reacted to his suffering and seeing like the lack of empathy there and how we could in turn change that and become more empathetic by witnessing the suffering of others. So yeah, those were my thoughts.
Now you can hear me talk. Hi, I'm Rebecca, and I looked at an art piece, another film actually. The film I looked at was A Serious Man, which it's a film by Ethan and Joel Coen, which the Coen brothers are extremely famous in Hollywood and everything for their movies. They usually make movies that are very thought provoking and have a lot of major themes, just like the one I'm going to be talking about. So I mainly looked into the comparisons of the story of Larry Gupnik, who is the main character in the film, versus Job, who's obviously the main character in the Bible in the story of Job. For A Serious Man, the film tells the story of Larry Gopnik, a Jewish physics professor living in Bloomington, Minnesota in 1967. In the film, Larry's life is falling apart all around him. His daughter and pothead son both steal money from him. His unemployed brother shows up as an unwanted house guest, and his wife Judith divorces him to go after another man. And then, on top of all of this, Larry gets into some legal trouble regarding a financial bribe that he accepts from a student. So, obviously, absolutely everything that could be going wrong in this man's life is going wrong. And it causes him to really question everything and where he's going in life and if life has a purpose, is the main question that he has. If there's only going to be suffering and if only things go wrong, then what is the purpose to these things going wrong? And I think that that's something we can definitely trace in the story of Job as well, because Job also suffers greatly, and he asks God, like, why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? He even gets to the point where he curses the day he was born. He like talks to God and says like, I wish I had never been born. I wish this didn't even happen. And it really makes you question like, okay, like how do we get to that point in our suffering where we regret even the good parts of our life that we've already experienced? So if we move to the next slide, then I picked up on some themes of suffering and storytelling, both this one mainly from the film, but definitely could relate to the story of Job as well. Both characters have regret over their past, feelings of hopelessness and lost direction, and both of them didn't have any sort of support system to back them up in their suffering. Job's wife absolutely rejected him. Even like I don't know if that was because of her grief and losing her children as well, but and then his friends questioned him and questioned Job, and he didn't have that support. And then it's the same for Larry. He does not have the support of his friends or family, especially his wife who's cheating on him, his kids who are literally stealing from him. And then on top of all this stuff, he gets into trouble at work, and he doesn't have anything, any kind of support for that suffering and grief that he's going through. So then finally, as far as like looking at the art piece for its art and technicality, I saw the filmmakers using color, camera angles, and editing to create a story of suffering through personal misfortune. That is reminiscent of the story of Job, even though the movie is technically considered a comedy, which that's funny that it is considered a comedy, but the way they tell the story is through like the actual art of the movie, meaning like the dialogue, the costuming, even anything from like the camera angles to, as if you can see on the pictures I've chosen, the coloring of the movie was just very, very dark and grim. And yeah, that's how it depicts suffering in this movie, was through all of the above that I mentioned. Yeah.
So I decided to look at Job under the reign of the Galactic Empire because I thought it sounded cool. No, I chose to look at Star Wars Rebels, which is a series on originally Disney XD and now Disney Plus. And I chose to look at the character Sabine, who was born to the House of Ren on Mandalore. And if we go ahead and move to the next slide, she was born during the end of the Clone Wars, the very beginning of the Galactic Empire. And she went into the Imperial Academy and worked for the Empire. And when they found out that they were actually trying to hurt her homeworld Mandalore, she rejected the Empire's control, and she tried to fight back and speak out against the Empire. And after this, she tried to convince her family of this, and her family cast her out, completely unbelieving her, not believing her, and siding with the Empire against her. And after losing her homeworld, her family, she went out and she stuck to her morals. She continued fighting against the Empire. She joined a rebel cell trying to fight back against these evils that she had seen on her homeworld. And in a later episode in the series, when she goes back to Mandalore to talk to her family again, it is implied that her family tried to convince her to stay on Mandalore and conform to the Empire's control. And through holding strong to her ideals and her beliefs and her morals, Sabine regains not only her family and those ties she had on Mandalore, but she also starts a rebellion against the evil of the Empire. And over on the right here, I have the story of Job. Much like Sabine, he had a great life. He was a man of high stature. He had numerous possessions and a large family. Sabine had a great life. She had 3 meals a day. She had a family that loved her. And yet Satan wished to test Job's fealty to God and takes away all of his possessions and family. And Sabine was cast out by her family. She lost everything, her house, everything but the clothes on her back. Yet even through this, Job stayed strong to his beliefs and his morals. And even though he did have these doubts about what was happening to him, and he questioned some of the things that God was doing, he still believed in God, and he worked to keep his morals straight and believed that he didn't do anything wrong. Which, when you look at Sabine's story, she never gave up on her morals. She continued moving forward and attempted to even regain her family ties. And after God responded to Job's arguments, Job was blessed with a greater wealth and stature than he had ever had before. Sabine regained not only her family ties, but she started a rebellion against the very evil that broke her from her family. And I will mention that the one thing that I did not mention on the slides is that God's response to Job is slightly reflected in the discussion Sabine has with her mentor that taught her how to fight. And so through all of these different examples, we found Job's story in numerous different ways, as you've seen in pop culture, whether it be through suffering, through the regaining of possessions or of stature, or lament, suffering. We found Job's story in these items of pop culture. And we hope that this helps you see the Bible is still affecting today and today's pop culture. And these are our references.